One of the most important pieces of this is actually an economic route that started under the Biden administration and is now being continued under the Trump administration. One of the real policies actually that's being continued, called IMEC. So something where you're going India, Middle East, Europe, fashioning this corridor, if you will, to not only encourage economic trade with all of these continents and locations and regions, but also a lot of that is about becoming a counterweight to China. And so that's going to be a lot of the focus of this trip. There are going to be many things actually that they're going to discuss that are not economic as well. But a lot of that too is making sure you're pulling Saudi Arabia from China, you're pulling the region away from China, ensuring that Saudi Arabia is trying to diversify its economy. They're interested in all sorts of investments back and forth. And so they're going to be looking for that, certainly an increase in any kind of trade related to defense equipment as well. That's something that Saudi Arabia struggles with Democrats and has better luck with Republicans. So they're going to be talking about things like that as well.
Well, and for the UAE especially, we know there's kind of chip considerations as well. Bloomberg has had some reporting on whether or not the administration is likely to lift chip restrictions on the UAE in particular. To your point, the whole point of that is to try to make sure those chips ultimately don't find their way to China. So maybe a lot of this does come back to China, but a lot of this is about this region as well in the current environment in the Middle East. When we consider the engagement we've seen from this administration so far with Israel as it relates to the ongoing conflict in Gaza, with Saudi Arabia as they look to expand the Abraham Accords, what really is, for Middle East purposes, objective number one for the president, do you think?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of wins for the president to achieve in Saudi Arabia. And one of the ones at the top of the list is the discussions that would lead to peace deals, a number of peace deals. They want to increase the Abraham Accords, increase the countries under the Abraham Accords as much as possible. The president, and I'm not trying to say this lightly, he is focused on a Nobel Peace Prize through the Abraham Accords. And he's been very clear about that, right? He was clear about that the first time around and now the second time around. And a lot of that, a big chunk of that is really through Saudi Arabia. Not all of the countries, but Saudi Arabia would be a big one because you'd get a lot of others in its trail. And those talks are talks that have already existed, right? So they've been going on for a while, really since the end of Trump's term, Trump 1.0. And so that's really, they're going to be continuing those talks. Now, there are certain things, elements of those talks initially that appears that they're also being pulled out. Things like discussing civil nuclear partnerships, things of that kind that were originally going to be part of a normalization deal or peace deal. And it looks as though that might be pulled out. But nonetheless, I think it'll all be in the context of getting to a final destination, and that destination being having Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries under the Abraham Accords.
What timeline do you think is realistic for that? This visit, I would imagine, is not going to be alone in accomplishing that.
No. Well, and the Saudis, unlike other countries, they've made it clear, and I don't think that they're going to backtrack on their insistence that there be the promise of a Palestinian state. It doesn't mean that one needs to be necessarily created or recognized, but that there be some kind of process to get there. And that's going to hamper things a little bit. I mean, if I were a betting woman, it's hard to say, maybe 2027. Sometimes I think it'll be in a year or so. And then other times there are days where I'm like, this is really happening. And then there are days where I think maybe another 2 years.
Yeah, well, every day is different around here, that's for sure. But to your point on there being some kind of day after long-term solution for the Palestinians in Gaza, where even are we on those conversations, on the idea of renewing any kind of ceasefire agreement or bringing some kind of end to this conflict? Because the administration was very focused on that, very proud of the deal reached on the eve of Trump's negotiation. And then what happened?
Yeah, and it's funny, the last time I was on, which was maybe 10 days ago, we discussed this, and there were a number of deals that were going back and forth, and there was a deal proposed by the Israelis that was rejected, then the Egyptians and Qataris had come in, and we are now really, unfortunately, in a spot where we've gone completely backwards. The war is being actively expanded by Israel in Gaza. It's a decision by the cabinet, but also more importantly, it was a decision that very clearly laid out that the hostages were not being prioritized. We don't know, but we believe we're hearing between 21 and 24 who are alive. I don't want to make any kind of assertion on this, but anyway, every day that passes is a risk for them. And we know that. And the cabinet really came out crystal clear and said, we are prioritizing the expansion of this because they have Hamas by the neck and they want to crush them completely. And as somebody who works in counterterrorism, I want nothing more than to see Hamas obliterated. My own opinion is I'm not sure I understand why they can't cut a deal, get the hostages released, and then do targeted operations as they have in Lebanon, for example. But because I'm completely behind the idea of crushing Hamas completely.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's Bibi's clearly very intent on that singular goal.
So what role does the U.S. play in influencing Israel in any of this, knowing that Israel also maybe have taken aback by some of the Trump administration's recent actions, including declaring a truce with the Houthis seemingly out of nowhere? Yeah,
I was just going to say that. So actually the Israelis, and this I think is a bit indicative of how things might go between the United States and Israel, is Bibi has been blindsided by the Trump administration a number of times now. So first you had, for example, the talks that were taking place directly with Hamas on the release of American hostages. You have the Iran talks, and now you have this deal that the U.S. administration cut with the Houthis, where the Houthis have promised not to target American vessels in the Red Sea, but that's it. Just the American vessels. And that deal not only blindsided Bibi, according to press reports, but it indicates it's very demonstrative of an America First policy, right? We care about our vessels, we care about our national security objectives only, and what is directly American, and we're going to pursue that unapologetically. And that makes it difficult. While Bibi seems to listen to Trump and has a lot of respect for him, or Trump has a lot of clout with Bibi, those kind of efforts are going to make it more difficult for the U.S. to push Bibi where they want.
You raised Iran in that last answer, and I do want to talk about that as well. As we learned today, another round of talks between the U.S. and Iran will take place this weekend, on Sunday specifically, in Oman. And I wonder how you see progress here, because we are still talking. This is the next round of talks in what has been a line of them in succession. But how far still does that put us from actually reaching some kind of agreement with Iran?
Yeah. So this one in particular, the thing that I think so important to talk about these talks is that what I see a lot in the public discourse out there is that, it's just a repeat of what the JCPOA under President Obama.
Is that thinking wrong?
He's completely wrong.
Okay.
He's completely wrong. And I worked on that deal as a spokesperson. I was Treasury spokesperson at the time. I worked on that deal when it was happening under President Obama. This is completely different. This is based on an assessment that Iran is very close to a nuclear weapon, that would fundamentally change things in the Middle East and would trigger an arms race and completely change our national security problems there. Then that means that it inevitably could lead to a military solution, and that these talks are a last-ditch effort. So the talks are a last-ditch effort, and unlike the ones under Obama, they don't go into the nitty-gritty of how many centrifuges can they have, which centrifuges where in Iran, how much can those centrifuges operate, how much uranium. No, it's very singularly focused on you, Iran, can never have a nuclear weapon. There is no timeline. It's never. If you don't agree, the U.S. or Israel, whichever, will bomb those nuclear facilities. And that is a threat Iran takes very seriously, because in October, Israel bombed the defense systems around those nuclear facilities and Tehran, and the Iranian regime is very weak at the moment, so they can't risk that.
So would they agree?
They are in a position where these talks could go well to agree, because they're desperate for a win, given that they're on the defense and that they need to survive and that they need sanctions lifted. But I don't know that everybody across the Middle East is happy about that, by the way. I don't think the Saudis are very excited about that. I know that those who are working against Hezbollah in Lebanon are not excited about that. They want nothing more, me included, to see the Iranian regime crushed.
Well, so President Trump could get an earful about this. He's not just coming to these countries with his own objectives. They probably have things they want to say to him in return.
Absolutely. And I believe the Trump administration, from everything I've seen and those I've spoken to, there is a very large focus on this question of triggering a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. That is what incentivized these talks. And you even saw it with the Vice President, J.D. Vance. He said earlier this week that he's hoping that these talks could open the door for for talks with China and Russia to talk about decreasing their nuclear weapons altogether, that everybody could. That's very, by the way, Reagan-esque way of looking at things. It's a positive goal, regardless of what people like me think of the Iranian regime. And so that's how they're going to couch it. And they're going to go to Saudi Arabia and say, listen, this is important. This is a priority. You need to support us, even if it's quietly behind the scenes, and let us do this. But I have no doubt that it will come with some kind of exchange of some kind, as it did under President Obama, whether it's defense equipment deals or whatever.